безопасности запрещается при следовании автобуса открывать окна. Также по прибытии на место не отходить от гида, не разбегаться. Вы не должны ничего трогать руками, тем более ничего брать. Должны быть внимательны, смотреть под ноги, не подходить к хрупким конструкциям.
On April the 26th, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., reactor number 4 in Chernobyl's Lenin nuclear power plant in the Ukraine went out of control. 2 explosions and a 10-day fire released billions of radioactive particles into the environment, contaminating vast territories in numerous countries.
Attention.
An exclusion zone within an approximately 30-kilometer radius around the plant was created, prohibited to all human life. The next day, the 135,000 inhabitants living inside this zone were evacuated. They would never return. Within this zone, now prohibited to human life, the wild fauna and flora were left on their own. What has happened to them during all these years? This is the silent, slow story of the animal and vegetable world subjected to radioactivity, as told by those who have observed and studied them since this fateful accident in 1986, the scientists.
Chernobyl offered some very exciting scientific opportunities for us to combine our interests in a way that couldn't be done in any other place.
Is there more birds, is there more rare species now than before?
Chernobyl is an amazing opportunity to understand the biological consequences of a major nuclear disaster.
Nous, on en est à notre 9e année de travail sur ce site. On a accumulé énormément de données et de connaissances. Par exemple, j'espère qu'on va réussir à expliquer ce qui se passe pour le plutonium.
Мы имеем дело не с лабораторией, где контролируются все условия, и где присутствует равномерное воздействие какого-то фактора на живые организмы. Меня зовут Сергей Гощак, я украинец, родился в Украине, в городе Запорожье. Когда авария произошла, мне пришла повестка из военкомата, что я должен явиться на призыв, и, как тогда очень многие мужчины, мог быть отправлен к разрушенному реактору в центр Чернобыльской зоны.
Like 800,000 other men from all over the USSR and officially named liquidators, Sergei was sent to the exclusion zone to literally liquidate the radioactivity. By chance, he was not sent to die scooping up uranium with a shovel. He was part of a military division whose mission was to clean the vehicles coming back from the plant 24/7. Everything was covered with extremely radioactive ash and dust. Domestic animals were shot and buried. The crops were buried, and the most contaminated villages were buried. Even the dirt was buried. After 55 days, an officer came over to Sergei and told him he'd received 25 Roentgens, the maximum authorized radiation dose, and had to leave the zone immediately. Driven from Chernobyl at 24 years of age, Sergei promised himself he'd return to this exclusion zone, but this time for his own research and regardless of his health. As soon as he finished his university education in biology and zoology, he and his wife Lena moved to Slavutic, the new city built in the forest 70 kilometers east of Chernobyl to house the relocated inhabitants. It is here that for the past 20 years he has gone on expeditions aboard his laboratory bus. Of all of the scientists, it is Sergei Gashchak who has, without a doubt, participated in the most studies inside the exclusion zone. After the men left, there was a dead calm. No one ventured into this sinister countryside, the big ghost town of Pripyat, the terrible villages where the army was sent to destroy everything so as to discourage any desire to return. But this calm would soon be disturbed by the curious comings and goings of this new, astonishing population, the scientists. Duly stamped passes in hand, they were authorized to cross this closely guarded barrier, the official entrance into the exclusion zone, then to go anywhere in this gigantic no-man's land, particularly to those zones reputed to be very dangerous because they gave off radioactivity thousands of times higher than normal.
Сбылись. Я объездил всю зону. Я, в общем-то, с биноклем, с фотоаппаратом, пешком, на машине, на лодке. За 20 лет, или уже даже больше, как я знаю этот регион, ну, несомненно, он мне стал очень близок.
The impact of these billions of radioactive atoms and radionuclides on the environment signified for each living organism, animal or vegetable, a battle that would be fought on a microscopic scale, perfectly invisible and deep within the cells, against molecules and chromosomes, among others.
There has always been radioactivity on us, and it has always been a part of our natural environment, and nature has learned to cope with this and has developed repair mechanisms that will take care of the consequences of radiation. But when we come to Chernobyl, of course, nature was not at all prepared for the sudden increase in radioactivity.
How would nature react? Never before had there been such a degree of contamination in so large an ecosystem. In this outdoor laboratory, scientists would uncover extraordinary phenomena. Surprisingly, they don't seem scared of the radioactivity.
Этот участок находится в 2 километрах от атомной станции. И здесь радиационный фон в 1000 раз выше нормального. Ну вот, здесь самец желтогорлой мыши. Это животное живет на очень загрязненной территории, наверняка очень грязная, хотя видим абсолютно прекрасном состоянии, очень живое, очень сильное, готово бороться за свою жизнь, кусаться, защищаться.
More than 2 decades after the catastrophe, nature seems to have, in a surprising way, taken back what rightfully belonged to it from Chernobyl. The exclusion zone is inhabited by numerous species of wild animals, some of which were not there before the accident. Several bears have moved in. You often see wild boar, does and deer or roebuck. Birds nest in the cement sarcophagus covering the defunct reactor, with radiation levels 1 million times above normal. But above all, like the mouse captured by Sergei Gashchak, all the animals seem to be perfectly healthy.
Это уже 2 дня ездим, и нельзя увидеть. Толковых следов нет, и дождь прошел.
In particular, Chernobyl's exclusion zone is inhabited by one very rare mammal that is practically extinct elsewhere on the planet because it was so successfully hunted by man, Przewalski's horses.
Где-то крутятся, возможно, рядом.
Katerina Slivinska is from the Kiev Institute of Zoology. She is specialized in and is passionate about these animals and has studied them since 1998.
Известно, что в мире их насчитывается чуть больше 1000 голов. Взяты были лошади из заповедника Аскания Нова, который находится на юге Украины. В заповеднике Аскания Нова лошадей Пржевальского до 100 голов. Территория там маленькая, и потому сюда привезли, так сказать, избыточное поголовье. Так, осенью в 1998 году 21 лошадь привезли в Чернобыльскую зону.
What Katerina doesn't want to say is that at that time, the directors of the Askania Nova Reserve sent the oldest and least healthy horses, convinced they were sentencing them to certain death.
Они прижились и чувствуют себя прекрасно. Саша, сколько сейчас живет в Чернобыле лошадей?
Ну, около 50 голов без молотника этого года.
Для лошадей здесь, мне кажется, рай.
Is Chernobyl's exclusion zone a paradise for the fauna? And what about the vegetation? It is exuberant. Trees are growing inside the housing projects in what used to be the new town of Pripyat. Slowly but surely, the vestiges of what was the ideal Soviet town are being engulfed by the forest. Each village has become a true jungle. As with the animals, the radiation does not seem to affect the vegetation. Does nature not care about radiation? The analysis of the mice captured by Sergei is even more troubling. These little rodents are an invaluable help because they let themselves easily get caught and, above all, have already reached over 40 generations after the accident, while man is only on the first. These animals can therefore give invaluable information on the long-term effects of radiation.
Вот молодой самец рыжей полевки, но уже в состоянии репродуктивной активности. Никаких видимых повреждений, эффектов. Но наверняка он грязный, поскольку из рыжего леса. Ну, наверняка очень грязный, поскольку он из рыжего леса. Поэтому мы посмотрим, насколько он грязный.
Sergei managed to install a gamma scope in his laboratory bus. This apparatus allows him to measure precisely the amount of radioactivity emitted by the bodies of the mice, and thus to determine whether or not they really are normal.
О, ну вот, характерно. Это активнее, чем наши многие источники калибровочные. Огромное количество цезия в этом животном. Потому что все животные, которые живут в рыжем лесу, они потребляют растения различные, ловят насекомых, корешки, грибы, все это едят и в результате накапливают огромное количество радиоактивности. Удивительно, конечно, как они там живут, как они выживают, размножаются, но выглядят они абсолютно здоровыми. Я бы удивился, если бы мы там поймали животное абсолютно чистое, а это абсолютно нормальное явление.
How is it possible that an animal this radioactive shows no visible alterations and can live in such an environment? In order to understand how nature could arrive at this paradoxical situation, we must go back to the time of the accident, and in particular, to the exact moment reactor number 4 exploded at 1:23 a.m. on April the 26th, 1986. To make matters worse, the reactor had just been refilled with combustible material. It contained 200 tons of uranium oxide.
Il y a une explosion, pas du tout une explosion nucléaire, une explosion thermique. La dalle de béton a été soulevée et tout le combustible a été dispersé dans l'environnement et ces particules sont retombées comme des boules de pétanque.
Denise Demoz and her team from the French Institute for Radio Protection and Nuclear Safety attempt to determine what has become of these particles in the soil. Had it all ended there, the explosion, this accident wouldn't have been so catastrophic because the radioactivity would have been contained within the 30-kilometer zone, because all these very heavy particles would have fallen right around the reactor. But unfortunately, a fire started and it burned for 10 days.
Au moment de l'incendie, dans le cœur du réacteur, la température est montée très haut. Et bon, il faut savoir que ce combustible, il contenait déjà tous les radioéléments, les produits de fission, produits d'activation qui sont générés dans une centrale nucléaire. Les plus lourds sont retombés assez rapidement à proximité de la centrale, mais les plus légers et les plus volatiles ont été dispersés assez loin.
A radioactive plume was thus formed, and it started a voyage, a very long voyage. The famous Chernobyl cloud was born, and it didn't care about borders drawn by men. This is its path from April the 26th to May the 9th, 1986, scientifically reconstructed using thousands of pieces of data. In 10 days, billions of radioactive particles were dispersed into the environment, wherever the wind blew, 30,000 times the amount of nuclear waste made by all of the nuclear power plants in the world in 1 year. Still today, 3% of the radiation to which we are exposed daily comes from the Chernobyl cloud.
En plus, la météo est intervenue puisque le vent a changé, donc le panache de contamination a tourné. Et la pluie s'en est mêlée, donc les endroits où il pleuvait, les éléments sont retombés, donc d'où les taches de contamination. À d'autres endroits, il ne pleuvait pas de retombées, zone non contaminée. D'où cette dispersion de la radioactivité en taches de léopard et cette difficulté, du coup, à traiter cette zone, puisqu'elle est complètement disparate.
Thousands of measurements enabled us to establish a map of contamination and to redraw the contours of the exclusion zone. The waste from the explosion and the ash fallout show the very brutal variations in the level of radioactivity, and it looks practically die-cut. A new enclosure was put in place that, despite everything, left highly contaminated regions out of this zone. In some, the population was never evacuated.
Ну вот еще один пример неравномерного распределения радиоактивных выпадений. Мы на территории западного радиоактивного следа, но тем не менее на дороге относительно чисто, а вокруг погибший сосновый лес, на месте которого вырос березняк. И чем дальше мы удаляемся от дороги, тем выше и выше радиационный фон. На дороге он был около 3, радиационный фон растет. И вот уже совсем недалеко от дороги достигает 28 микрозиверт в час.
28 microsievert per hour, 1,000 times the normal level of radioactivity in the Ukraine. In this gigantic and extremely complex open-air laboratory, scientific theories would be severely put to the test in reality. For Denis Stamos's team, tracking the radionuclides is a long and delicate job. By installing tubes to different depths, the scientists sample the rainwater that filters in naturally due to gravity and traverses the ground, contaminated by radionuclides. Within this on-location laboratory, the water is patiently filtered before being discarded by the Earth. Then, hundreds of little bottles are sent to the Institute's Parisian laboratory, where the smallest radioactive particle will be detected and counted. The results are unexpected, to say the least.
D'après les études menées en laboratoire ou la littérature, on s'attendait à ce que le plutonium ne bouge pas du tout. Or, les premières mesures que l'on réalise depuis 2 ans montrent que le plutonium se déplace.
These plutonium atoms resulting from nuclear fission are extremely toxic, even at very low doses. We now know that they are not definitely fixed in the exclusion zone, but are likely to leave the zone at some unknown time in the future and to be transported by the rivers. It will take 240,000 years for these atoms to lose their radioactivity.
Et c'est pour ça qu'on poursuit les prélèvements et qu'on affine encore l'analyse de nos solutions pour essayer de comprendre quel est le mécanisme à l'origine de cette mobilité de plutonium.
In Chernobyl, the scientists observe the consequences of a nuclear accident in a real-life situation, very different from laboratory experiments where everything is controlled. Under the springtime sun of 1986, when millions of atoms, each one more radioactive than the next, beat down on nature, an immense battle began. Scientists call this the acute phase. The living organisms, plants and animals who were unfortunate enough to be covered by this layer of ash were confronted with an enormous amount of radioactivity directly in contact with their cells. These organisms were subjected to the formidable fire of radioactivity. The nuclei of radioactive atoms are very unstable. They disintegrate and release photons. These photons are pure energy traveling at the speed of light. They traverse matter. There are millions of them. This radiation is completely invisible. It's gamma radiation. When these photons come into contact with matter, they provoke collisions all along their trajectory. They will break molecules. Pieces of molecules, which scientists call free radicals, drift away. These free radicals are very toxic and will in turn destroy other molecules. At very high doses, these thousands of cascading breaks provoke the destruction of cells and therefore tissue. The living organisms were not prepared for this type of attack at such high doses. In the days and months following the catastrophe, cadavers of animals and the remains of insects and flowers could be counted in the tens of millions in the exclusion zone, and microorganisms and bacteria in the billions. Thousands of pines near the power plant reddened over a few weeks and died. The scientists then named this sinister forest the Red Forest. The stigmata of this battle are still visible. The Red Forest was soon to become one of the most astonishing laboratories on the planet, in which there would be a series of mysteries and paradoxes. Over 400 abnormal births of domestic animals were said to have been observed around the zone in the months and years following the catastrophe. But because of the leopard skin fallout, practically undamaged zones neighbored others that had been completely emptied of their fauna, which had been exterminated by the violent doses of radioactivity. Unlike nuclear bombs, which are flashes and irradiate in short bursts, here the radionuclides that fell randomly will continue to radiate discreetly until they disintegrate and become stable atoms.
Les éléments radioactifs sont généralement caractérisés par leur période ou demi-vie. Cette demi-vie correspond au temps au bout duquel le radioélément a perdu la moitié de sa radioactivité. Ce qui veut dire qu'au bout de 10 périodes, l'élément est considéré comme non radioactif. Certains de ces éléments radioactifs ont des demi-vies très courtes, quelques secondes, quelques jours. Ce qui veut dire que maintenant, leur radioactivité est inexistante. Ils ne sont plus radiotoxiques. Mais d'autres éléments comme le plutonium, l'amériциum, l'uranium ont des demi-vies beaucoup plus longues, centaines de milliers d'années.
Today, after more than 2 decades, less than 3% of the radioactive atoms exist in Chernobyl's exclusion zone. But those that remain will be there for a very long time, and the scientists don't know exactly how they will behave in nature. The Chernobyl zone has entered a new stage, which the scientists call the phase of chronic low-dose radioactivity. These doses are nothing like those in the years following the accident, but despite everything, they are still thousands of times higher than the norm. Season after season, year after year, carried by the natural decomposition of the vegetation, residual radionuclides would slowly sink into the soil and enter into contact with the plant's roots. The living organisms, whether they were plant or animal, were going to absorb these atoms either by inhalation or through food. They would therefore have to fight against an enemy within, be subject to internal irradiation and become radioactive themselves. The entire food chain in the exclusion zone would be compromised. Boris Sorochinsky is a radioecologist and botanist and has closely followed the vegetation's combat against these microscopic invaders. He has dedicated more than 17 years of his life to trying to understand the subtleties of plants' reactions to the radionuclides. Today, the radioactivity emitted in the Chernobyl zone is mainly due to 2 radionuclides still present, cesium-137 and strontium-90, as they each have a half-life of approximately 30 years. Therefore, it will take 10 half-lives for them to disappear, that is, around the year 2286. These 2 radionuclides play major roles in this long-term war and provoke a surprising and unexpected redistribution of radioactivity.
Зараз маємо дуже цікавий феномен, коли ізотопи в залежності від типу ґрунту, від покриття рослинного, від форми фізико-хімічної проемігрували на 20, на 30 сантиметрів і зустрілися з тією кореневою системою, яку сформували рослини. З свого боку, рослини почали поглинати цю радіоактивність. Так що частина радіоактивності знаходиться знизу, а частина радіоактивності попала в рослини, в клітинки, які діляться, в меристеми. І зараз рослини помаленьку зазнають тих ефектів, які обумовлені хронічним опроміненням за рахунок інтеркороплених, включених ізотопів, які знаходяться всередині рослинної тканини. Це так звані ефекти малих доз опромінення, хронічного опромінення, які, напевно, варто вивчати. Якщо подивитись на дозиметр, дозиметр нам покаже, що радіоактивність розподілена в зоні дуже нерівномірно. І залежно від характеру забруднення, від того, які рослини живуть на тій чи іншій території, звичайно, ізотопи по-різному поглинаються рослинами. І можна зустрітися з феноменом, коли вже навіть зараз радіоактивність на поверхні ґрунту може відрізнятися і бути меншою від тієї радіоактивності, яка акумульована рослинами. Ось за рахунок таких акумульованих радіонуклідів рослини і зазнають внутрішнє опромінення в хронічному режимі від поглиненого джерела радіації.
How does the vegetation react when faced with this internal contamination and radiation? Carl Magnus Larsson from the Swedish Radio Protection Agency knows these questions well, as he coordinated the research of over 30 European laboratories on the subject.
Radiation causes DNA damage or DNA breaks, and this can be caused either directly or through the generation of free radicals. But nature has evolved repair mechanisms that will actually take care of many of these damages to the DNA.
One of the main systems of reparation is based on the fact that the chromosomes are made up of two practically identical strands interlinked in a double helix. One serves as the model for the one that is damaged. Molecular machinery replaces the missing elements by comparing the two strands gene by gene. As soon as a piece of chromosome is missing, it replaces it.
But the repair mechanisms are not necessarily error-free. You may end up with some errors in the repairs. You will have a mutation, and the cell may eventually die, but on the other hand, it may also continue to multiply, and you will have a mutation that goes on.
Mutations are at the origin of the appearance of abnormalities because the genes created by chance express themselves in a completely random way. After over 2 decades, is it possible to see any? Boris Sorochinsky has gone to search for them.
For your interest. Мені дуже подобається цей тип морфозів, тому що я його не зустрічав серед листяних рослин досить довго. Зараз вони знову з'явилися. Знову ж таки, одна з можливих причин морфозів – це внутрішнє опромінення, інкорпоровані ефекти від радіонуклідів. Морфози, бачите, зв'язані зі зміною розміру пластинки, зі зміною форми пластинки. І знову ж таки з'являються дуже великі гігантські форми листків, які ми не бачимо в нормі на багатьох деревах, що ростуть тут. Я хочу просто порівняти 2 листочки, які ростуть поруч з розмірами. Дуже велика різниця в морфології, дуже велика різниця в розмірах. Тут гарний приклад аномалії. Коротенька хвоя і довга хвоя. Ось приклад уже досить дорослого дерева, де явно відсутнє апікальне домінування. Ви бачите, що сосни ростуть вверх, а тут сосна, бідна, не знає, куди її рости, тому що проснулося дуже багато бічних меристем, і сосна росте в різні сторони, схожа на кульку таку собі. Таких дерев тут дуже багато, це для мене дещо дивно.
In this long-term war where vegetation fights radiation, although there are losers like the pines, there are also winners that have been subjected to the same doses of radioactivity.
Ми знаходимося серед насаджень берези. Радіоактивність тут приблизно така сама, як і була в родому лісі, але якщо подивитися уважно на дерева берези, то морфологічних аномалій тут ми не побачимо. Чому? Причин багато. З одного боку, мова йде про те, що різні організми по-різному реагують на ту саму дозу опромінення. З іншого боку, береза є більш радіостійкою, оскільки, вже говорили про це, геном у неї відрізняється концептуально від геному голоносінних, на прикладі сосни.
The birch is particular. Its genome, the sum total of its chromosomes, takes up very little space in the nuclei of its cells. The probability that the chromosomes will be hit by radiation is therefore low. On the other hand, resinous plants have an enormous genome that takes up a lot of space. The chromosomes have a much higher likelihood of getting hit and thus broken and divided by radiation. The differences in resistance of the plants disrupted the ecosystem. The landscape underwent a metamorphosis. Not a single pine grew back where the pines died. Only the skeletons of the trees bear witness to the 1986 tragedy. Birches invaded all of the free space. This forest is the most radioactive on the planet, over 10,000 times greater than the norm, and yet the trees are totally normal.
Це не дивно, абсолютно різні для різних об'єктів, навіть при тому самому дозовому навантаженні. Це нормально, це говорить про те, що природа різноманітна і, відповідно, біологічні ефекти бувають дуже-дуже різні для різних об'єктів.
Does this different behavior when confronted with radionuclides exist in other plants too? This garden is in the center of the city of Chernobyl, 18 kilometers from the reactor, and has been contaminated by the catastrophe. This is Leonid Bogdan's house. He lives alone. He moved back to Chernobyl after his divorce. He is an exception here and is living here illegally. The 2,000 employees that are responsible for managing the exclusion zone live in dormitories and eat in a dining hall where all the food is imported from clean zones. It is strictly forbidden to cultivate the land in the exclusion zone, and it's easy to understand why. So is this man crazy? Actually, not so much. Leonid has a very particular job in the zone. He has been the director of a laboratory that measures the amount of radioactivity for the past 20 years, so he knows what he's doing.
Сегодня съесть всю, потому что, вижу, она уже начала чуть-чуть портиться. Прилетела пчела, тоже черешни хочет. Эта черешня, она, как и все деревья, тоже берет на себя цезий, стронций, но крайне мало. А мякоть, что не успевает взять стронций. Стронций только в этой косточке, которую мы, конечно, уже не кушаем. А мякоть сама очень сладкая, вкусная и красная. Ну, так что желательно кушать только мякоть, а косточки еще оставлять для других.
Leonid's life in Chernobyl is calm. Life in this city that has such a strange atmosphere, where you sometimes come across a few people in military fatigues and that is forbidden to children and pregnant women, is very strange. It's a privilege to be employed in the exclusion zone because employees get double wages for just 15 days of work per month. Each morning, Leonid crosses the center of the city to get to his laboratory, which is installed in an old daycare center. Scientists examined thousands of plants from the zone and uncovered the behavioral subtleties of cesium-137 and strontium-90. They discovered that these two radioactive atoms worked their way into living tissue in a completely surprising way, by acting like lures.
Утро доброе. Какие у нас очередные сегодня пробы, самые такие главные?
Так, привезли пробу рыжего леса. Сейчас осталось только взвесить на весочку. Отдадим на измерение.
И померяем. Да.
Starting with a few grams of plant matter, Leonid measures the radiation emitted by the radioactive cesium and strontium contained in the leaves, each having its own specific properties in frequency and strength.
Цезий и стронций, в частности, в березах поглощается в очень больших количествах, так как этим деревьям больше, чем других, что необходим калий и кальций, что в свою очередь, что заменяется в зоне цезием и стронцием, это соседние же элементы группы. Там цезия и стронция очень большое количество, и что потребляемость от березы в этих же элементах, то есть очень высока.
Nature's fight against these invaders is made difficult. Living organisms have no way of distinguishing them from potassium and calcium. They never had the slightest chance of coming across them since the beginning of the world, and for good reason. They were invented by modern man and his waste.
Да, то есть все растения, то есть всем растениям необходим кальций и калий. И в каждого растения потребность в них разная, но так они и по-разному накапливают цезий и стронций. То есть этот переход калий-цезий или кальций-стронций в научном всегда можно подтвердить. Пользуюсь продуктами, частью, то есть я пользуюсь продуктами питания своего огорода, который сажу сам и собираю. На первых порах я провел полный анализ всего, что там я уже выращивал, как-то там щавель, там петрушка, укроп, там картошка, редис, там лук, там помидоры, огурцы, то есть все, что там уже растет. Смерил, что получил цифры, сделал выводы. Некоторые, то есть растения полностью изъел, такие как виноград, как щавель, как черная смородина.
Leonid can therefore eat the carefully selected and thoroughly examined products in his garden without worrying. The situation is very different for the exclusion zone's wild fauna, which blithely ingest thousands of atoms of cesium and strontium every day. If any animals are exposed to radiation, the mice living in the red forest certainly are. They live at ground level and are subjected to high levels of external radioactivity coming from the ground and the vegetation. This adds to the internal radiation due to their diet, which bombards them 24/7. Since 1994, Robert Baker from Texas Tech University in the United States has been passionately studying the Chernobyl mice. Today, his laboratory has a collection of thousands of carefully conserved animal samples from the exclusion zone, which he makes available to scientists around the world. In 1994, he began a long-term scientific collaboration with Sergei Gashchak. The first mission appears obvious given the radioactive environment in which the mice live throughout their lives.
So we thought this would likely cause mutation, so that was a logical way to see. And the biggest fear humans have, I think, of radiation and a Chernobyl type thing is one, that they will get cancer, but I think the biggest fear is that their children will have birth defects. And so understanding the way that that would happen would be to have mutations. So immediately we started looking for mutations.
The first thing to do is to capture a large number of mice so as to ensure the statistical validity of the results. The mice present two enormous advantages. They are easier to catch than large mammals, and their biology is very close to that of humans. The next part of this study took place in Slavutich, in Sergei's radioecology laboratory that was created in 1999 in order to study the effect of radiation on the environment. For the DNA sequencing, a small piece of claw from each mouse suffices. These samples were then placed in an incubator for just as long as it took to send them to Texas, to Robert Baker's laboratory.
Attention. No.
It was here, at the Texas Tech University in Lubbock, that the genes from Chernobyl's mice were decrypted, one by one.
We're comparing clones from clean animals. We were shocked at what we found, that there was a high rate of mutations in the animals that were from the most radioactive regions. And we were confident that we had done this study correctly, so we published this paper in Nature saying that Chernobyl indeed caused a huge number of mutations.
In April 1996, Chernobyl's mice became famous. Robert Baker's paper on their mutations made the cover of Nature, the most prestigious scientific journal. It was at that moment that an event would disturb the lives of the team of scientists from Texas Tech University. They would experience one of the worst moments in their careers. A few weeks after the publication, Robert Baker equipped his laboratory with an automated DNA sequencing machine and decided to redo the experiments. The results came in. Everything was wrong. The supermice from Chernobyl were not mutants, they were normal. But then why were previous results false?
Pretty long read, though. Yeah, it is. It's a long read. So those results were generated by manual sequencing, which everyone knew has a high error rate. There is a mutation rate, but that is very low relative to what we had reported. And so we knew that the science that we had reported was wrong, was inaccurate.
The results of the low mutation rate generated by the automated sequencer showed that the mice actually belonged to different species that were genetically close. Robert Baker's team mistook simple, natural genetic differences having nothing to do with radiation for artificial mutations. Robert Baker had just carried out a simple taxonomy study, an identification of different species of mice living in this very radioactive zone.
I know we did not attempt to be dishonest. If we had, we could have covered up our mistake. But the right thing to do, it's important to society to have honest science. And I believe that, and my colleagues that were on the team believe that, and we all agreed to retract it. We've attempted to show that there's an effect. If we found an effect, we would report that effect. We're not opposed to that if that's the truth, but at this time, it looks like the animals not only are doing well, but their genomes are not being reorganized.
How was it possible that these mice had not mutated after over 40 generations in such a radioactive environment? Continuing their research, Robert Baker's team uncovered the explanation of the presence of numerous species of mice in the Chernobyl zone that were closely related genetically. During the period of high radioactivity immediately following the accident, immense zones were emptied of their animals as they were all exterminated, leaving free spaces without a single living animal.
And as the environment stabilized and the radiation got low enough that it wasn't causing radiation poisoning to kill them, then they were able to come back in and exploit their normal habitats. And more young are born in every species than can survive. So it's easy for them to expand back into this area, even though they're doing all of their life cycle with radiation. They're producing sperm and eggs, they're doing their embryology, they're doing their breeding. Everything is all done while they're in a radioactive environment, and they're doing, best we can tell, just fine.
Species of mice genetically close to those exterminated at the time of the accident and living in the surrounding area came to colonize the spaces emptied of their fauna after the accident. They mixed together and then spread out in the Chernobyl zone. Robert Baker's team therefore mistook natural genetic differences for mutations due to radiation. This situation may have been repeated by many other animal species in the Chernobyl zone. It is possible that animals from elsewhere that were not affected by the strong radioactive contamination slowly repopulated the zones left empty, bringing with them their natural genetic variations. Chernobyl's exclusion zone became a giant trap for scientists, because here it is very tempting to attribute everything that doesn't appear normal to radiation. There is a real challenge for the scientists: unravel the true from the false, isolate the causes, and attribute the effects to them. But how to prove that that which appears to be an anomaly is really due to radiation? To add to the difficulties, the researchers are confronted with a major obstacle: the incredible overlapping of phenomena belonging to very diverse scientific specialities. Is this five-trunk tree normal? Are these flowers normal? Is this animal normal? However, one thing is certain: as with the plants, the animals cannot help but absorb the radioactive cesium and the strontium that resemble potassium and calcium. Cesium accumulates especially in muscles and glands, and strontium accumulates in bones in place of calcium.
У тех животных, которые обитают в Чернобыльской зоне, если даже мы и способны какие-то эффекты обнаружить, мы должны быть весьма взвешены, весьма осторожны в своих интерпретациях, суждениях, потому что эти эффекты могут быть вызваны не обязательно радиационным воздействием. Эти эффекты могут быть вызваны вполне естественными причинами, другими причинами, такими как внутрипопуляционные, межпопуляционные какие-то взаимодействия генетические, физиология животных, обитающих на территориях с определенным микроэлементным составом, дефицитом, допустим, каких-то микроэлементов в почве, что мы имеем на территории Полесья. Это может быть результат какого-то текущего климатического воздействия, засушливый год, либо наоборот очень влажный, либо вспышка численности каких-то паразитов и так далее, и так далее, и так далее. Это остатки оленухи. И ее скелет полон стронция. Его тут гораздо больше, чем на земле, на которой он лежит. Это все потому, что стронций накапливается избирательно в костях и создает определенные проблемы для здоровья животных, которые здесь живут. Но в целом они выглядят вполне нормально. И это животное погибло совсем не от того, что у него накопился стронций, потому что его поймали и съели волки.
But how can we know whether wolves devoured this animal because it was weakened by long-term cesium and strontium contamination? How can we evaluate the state of health of all of the fauna that is subjected to radioactivity? Mice don't move very much over the course of their existence and are easy to study. But what about the large mammals that cover great distances? They are there, that is certain, in unknown numbers, as they are not counted due to a lack of means, and they appear to be in good health. But like in any zone with wild animals on the planet, the weakest are not visible because their predators devour them.
У них сейчас весна, потомство.
There is very interesting scientific data on one big mammal, the most emblematic of the Chernobyl zone, Przewalski's horses.
Нами было исследовано накопление радионуклидов в организме лошади Przewalskiego. И все это сравнивалось и с накоплением радионуклидов в домашних лошадей на этой же территории. И было установлено, что коэффициент накопления, так называемый, у лошади Przewalskiego в сравнении и с домашними лошадьми в 3 раза ниже. Чем это объясняется? Возможно, это связано с особенностями питания и, собственно, метаболизма лошадей, диких лошадей. Потому что, как известно, что трава проходит быстрее через кишечник дикой лошади, и, соответственно, меньше времени у радионуклидов, чтобы впитаться в стенку кишечника.
By selecting breeds of horses over thousands of years, men have little by little made them lose this characteristic. Przewalski's horses have never allowed themselves to be domesticated and remain prehistoric and robust.
Интерес для науки представляет расшифровка генотипа дикой лошади Пржевальского. Известно, что 66 генов у дикой лошади Пржевальского и 64 гена у домашней лошади. Так вот, именно расшифровка дополнительной пары генов может дать ответ на вопрос репарации клетки и устойчивости от радиации.
Although the effects of radioactivity on large mammals are mysteries still waiting to be solved, two scientists have been passionate about Chernobyl's birds for the past 18 years and have accumulated thousands of pieces of data on them. Are birds resistant to cesium and strontium like mice are? And are there more now than there were before the accident?
In order to address that specific question, that's the reason we've gone out and done all these bird counts. We've counted many different organisms, including insects and mammals, and we find no evidence at all that it's anything approaching a wildlife Eden. In fact, just the opposite.
Since 1991, Anders Moller, researcher at the Paris branch of the French National Center for Scientific Research, and Tim Mousseau from the University of Southern Carolina in the United States, count Chernobyl's birds each year according to strict ornithological rules. They are particularly looking to see whether there are differences between heavily contaminated zones, like the Red Forest, and lightly contaminated areas, differences that could establish a direct link between the bird's presence, or lack thereof, and the level of radioactivity.
And what we found was that there were dramatic decreases in both the abundance, the total numbers of birds, as well as the numbers of species of birds in the more contaminated areas. And this pattern was again repeated in every place we went to.
In the zones they studied, Anders and Tim counted 1,570 individuals divided between 50 species. But the richness of the species was halved in the very contaminated zones, and the number of birds per species reduced by 2/3. The situation of the birds appears to be very different from that of the rodents. Robert Baker and Sergei Gashchak's work shows that, to the contrary, there are more species in the most contaminated areas due to repopulation by the surrounding regions, and they proliferate.
And our team set up grids and studied how many animals there were and whether or not they were stable or whether they were disappearing quickly or not, and clearly their life expectancy in the zone is not different than we were able to observe outside the zone. Well, even in the Red Forest, the grass is very deep and the habitat is very healthy. And there are more individuals inside the enclosure than there are in comparable spots outside of the enclosure, the 30K zone.
Although numerous rodents in the exclusion zone show no visible anomalies and have normal life expectancies, does the same hold true for the birds? In the ruins of Chernobyl's old kolkhoz, those symbols of Soviet agriculture, Anders Moller and Tim Mousseau would make their most important discoveries on the effects of low doses of radioactivity, and this despite a low level of contamination in this place. Something these researchers, who have captured and studied 15,000 swallows worldwide, had never seen before.
It's quite amazing, the number of developmental abnormalities. Here in the barn swallows that we've looked at, we've found tumors on the feet, tumors on the neck, tumors around the eye.
Something strange.
Earlier today, we discovered a dwarf egg that was produced, an egg that was perhaps 25% normal size. This has never been observed in any other population before. And when you add up all of these abnormalities, as we have been for the last several years, we find that there are perhaps 14 or 15 different kinds of abnormalities, 10 of which have never been seen in any other population in the world.
One of the clear signs of radiation in this area is that birds have small spots of that lack coloration, so feathers that are white, partial albinism. And this is a phenomenon that is quite rare in nature. The only other place where partial albinism is common is in some big cities like Paris or Moscow, because there's relatively high levels of pollution. Here we have seen several different kinds of morphological abnormalities in feathers. One of them is asymmetry, the differences in the length of feathers on the right and the left side of the body. And of course, in most birds that fly a lot, it's problematic not to have wings of the same length or the two sides of the tail of the same length. That will make them less aerodynamic.
Anders Moller and Tim Mousseau showed premature aging in swallows and a year-to-year survival rate of only 30%, whereas the normal life expectancy is 14 months. But the most serious abnormalities were discovered in the sperm samples.
I've recorded up to more than 50% of all sperm in swallows being with an abnormal morphology. And this is clearly bad for the birds because such sperm are generally unable to fertilize.
Many of the birds that we were seeing taking up residence in the zone, barn swallows, were actually immigrants to the zone and not part of, they had not been born in the zone, in fact. And this combined with the fact that we see lower survival rates, dramatically lower survival rates at many of these sites, implied to us that some of these populations, many of these populations perhaps, are only sustained by continuous immigration of new birds.
The swallows decimated by radiation thus leave space for new arrivals, who in turn come and die. Is Chernobyl, which despite man has become one of Europe's largest animal sanctuaries, in reality a trap, an immense well of biodiversity in which birds from elsewhere come to die? But then, is it really possible that the mice that so proliferate show no visible anomalies?
We've handled several thousand mice, and we have not seen a single mouse that had what I would say would be abnormal growths. We've necropsied a lot of individuals. We've never seen cancerous growth that we could detect.
If no pathology is apparent in the mice, what about their internal organs? Are they untouched? Laboratory studies would show the formidable defense strategies of these tiny animals when confronted with radiation.
Радиация сама по себе фактор очень жесткий и однозначно негативный. И в этом несложно убедиться, если проводить длительные исследования, если рассматривать, к примеру, препараты клеточных тканей, различных желез внутренней секреции, делящихся тканей у живых организмов, которые обитают на наиболее загрязненной территории и каких-то менее загрязненных, либо территориях, которые мы рассматриваем как контроль, присутствуют. Например, Здесь мы видим строение средств надпочечника у рыжей полевки из контрольной популяции, то есть те, которые живут в более-менее чистых условиях. Абсолютно нормальная структура ткани, видны все необходимые слои. Но так вот выглядит тот же самый надпочечник в условиях рыжего леса. Очевидно, отклонение, нарушение, патологии. Не вызывает никакого сомнения, что животные, которые обитают в условиях такого радиационного поля, испытывают большое стрессовое воздействие. У них напряжены все системы, которые поддерживают их, восстанавливают, компенсируют нанесенный ущерб. Однако, тем не менее, в организме, любом организме, достаточно компенсаторных сил, механизмов, которые позволяют компенсировать и поддерживать существование организма даже в этих условиях, когда что-то работает хуже. Есть дублирующие системы.
Then why don't the swallow's organisms defend themselves in the same way? In 2007, Anders Moller and Tim Musso discovered the probable reason for this deficiency after hundreds of samples and analysis. One reason could be linked to the fact that the swallows do not reside there throughout the year. In fact, during their enormous effort in migrating from Africa, the swallows consume a large part of their stock of antioxidants, and these molecules play an important role in the fight against radiation. When the radiation cuts the molecules and generates extremely toxic free radicals, antioxidants destroy them.
In the most contaminated areas, antioxidant levels were dramatically lower than they were in the less contaminated areas. And this to us implied that perhaps that the antioxidants were actually being used up to deal with the effects of ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is well known to generate free radicals that can damage DNA, cause mutations. And so it was very exciting for us to make this correlation, to observe this relationship between radiation and depressed antioxidant levels.
Arriving in Chernobyl in the contaminated zones, the quantity of antioxidants they have left is rapidly consumed to fight against the avalanche of free radicals. As soon as their stock is depleted, the free radicals will destroy the living tissue. The negative effects do not take long to become visible. What then is the mechanism that enables the mice not to show any similar signs? It was only in 2008, after 14 years of intensive research, that a new step in understanding the extraordinary resistance of mice would be taken. Robert Baker's team began a new experiment led by Brenda Rogers that shed light on the mice's completely unexpected defense strategy.
When we started experiments initially in the exclusion zone, we expected we would see a lot of mutations, maybe even deformities in the organisms. We certainly didn't see that. And so suddenly we've got a mystery there. Here are these organisms living in this environment, yet there seems to be no consequence to that. So we began then to investigate what's going on, what's allowing this. And as the wildlife there and organisms seem to be thriving in the environment, could perhaps this radiation exposure be conferring some adaptive benefit to the organism?
For 45 days, Brenda Rogers' team placed white lab mice that are completely unused to radiation in the red forest. Another group was placed in a non-contaminated zone for comparison. Each day, the mice received a dose of gamma radiation approximately 1,000 times above average, which, despite that, scientists consider to be a low dose. At the end of the first part of the experiment, the mice were taken back to Slavutic. Brenda Rogers then gave the two groups a violent dose of radiation. She administered 1.5 grays, enough to provoke innumerable molecular breaks, particularly chromosomal, but this time it was in a few fractions of a second. Would the mice that had been exposed to low doses of radiation better resist this violent irradiation?
We wanted to see then, did that low-level exposure allow us to see less DNA damage than in the organisms that had not received it? We know that 1.5 gray is enough radiation to break DNA.
Brenda Rogers waited 24 hours, and everything would be played out in that time. The organisms of the mice fought hard against the numerous molecular breaks provoked by the radiation.
The results were very interesting because in the animals that had not received the 10 centigrade dose, we did see chromosome breaks, as you would expect, at that level. In the animals that had received the 10 centigrade dose, prior to that 1.5 gray dose, they had lower levels of DNA damage. And so, this then brings up the question, is this actually beneficial to the organism? Are we seeing a hormetic effect here?
A hormetic effect is a positive effect and thus beneficial at low doses. Brenda Rogers then attempted to determine whether the low dose received in the Red Forest might have stimulated certain genes that participate in the defense against radiation.
We didn't see a change or an upregulation of repair genes, as you might expect, and those are the ones that we were looking for initially. What we saw instead was a shift in the regulation of genes responsible for free radical scavenging and those in the system.
The free radicals from the molecules broken due to violent gamma radiation exposure are eliminated much more efficiently. Above all, they disappear rapidly before they have time to destroy chromosomes.
We also saw an upregulation of genes that are involved in the pathway for programmed cell death. And so perhaps then these organisms have a better mechanism of removing damaged cells from the system than the mice that haven't been exposed previously.
The last experiments Brenda Rogers carried out go even further. They show that low doses could also protect the mice against threats other than radiation.
It seems to be an acquired response. And so it seems to be that the animals that had a history of living in the Chernobyl zone, genetic background of low-dose radiation exposure, have immune systems that respond very quickly to other insults, especially other chemicals.
These chemical poisons are notably chemotherapy medications. Brenda Rogers' dream is to have her research help people in the near future. We can imagine that one day the negative side effects of chemotherapy and radiotherapy could be diminished through long-term, low-level irradiation, as in the Chernobyl mice. Do these unprecedented mechanisms brought to light by the mice exist in other animals, which would explain their unexpected good health? Or, on the contrary, are other species weakened like the swallows, and will they discreetly disappear? Although many of these questions remain to be answered in Chernobyl, studying the effect of radiation on the ecosystem is still complicated by a factor that has proven to be fundamental: the departure of the humans in 1986 and everything they left on location when they fled.
О, здесь гнездо с птенчиками, какой-то птички. Их здесь 4 птенчика. Ну, не все так тут хорошо бывает положительно. Эти же комбайны могут быть и местом для гнездования, но вот они же являются ловушкой и для птиц. Мертвая синица. В то же время, если рассматривать всю Чернобыльскую зону в целом, то могу абсолютно ответственно заявить, куда больше риск представляют куда более обычные факторы, причем связанные с человеком. В частности, огромное количество мусора, огромное количество брошенных металлических предметов, стеклянных предметов, колодцы заброшенные, открытые люки, полуразрушенные здания, где человек, и не только человек, может пострадать.
One of the paradoxes of the Chernobyl zone is that the things that play the main roles may not be those you'd expect. They are completely different from radioactivity. They are discreet and undetectable for those who do not know how to decipher nature's images. Sergei Gaschak is one of the rare scientists who studies them.
Ну, такая вот ситуация до аварии была очень редка, потому что в промышленных лесах лесники старались сохранять только здоровые деревья, а все больные, старые, мертвые деревья убирали как источник всякой заразы, как болезней грибковых, паразитарных болезней для соседних деревьев. В то же время следует учесть, что все эти деревья, больные, мертвые, являются таким же нормальным элементом лесной экосистемы, как и здоровые деревья. И они являются и кормовым объектом, и домом для очень многих организмов. И сейчас, после аварии, таких деревьев очень много, и мертвых деревьев очень много. И поэтому в целом биоразнообразие в лесу возросло. Это благоприятствует появлению и летучих мышей, и многих насекомых, различных других птиц и млекопитающих, которые живут на старых деревьях, дуплах. Поэтому в целом наличие таких больных деревьев в экосистемах Чернобыльской зоны очень играет важную роль, благотворную роль для дальнейшего их развития. Ну и как водится в таких случаях, на месте упавшего дерева-гиганта свет наконец начинает проникать на землю. И это дает шансы для новых деревьев, для новых видов. И цикл жизни продолжается по новому кругу.
Before the accident, the foresters spread great quantities of chemicals in these forests that were planted in straight lines as decided by Khrushchev in the 40s. In the same way, immense fields of grain cultivation were covered with fertilizer, pesticide and fungicide. The entirety of this zone was subjected to high levels of chemical pollution that abruptly stopped in May of 1986.
И отсутствие человека, отсутствие его деятельности сказалось, несомненно, самым положительным образом. Животные и растения стали развиваться таким образом, все эти земли, все эти ландшафты стали развиваться таким образом, совершенно независимо от человека, по своим собственным законам. И в конечном итоге стали более богаче, более разнообразнее, чем это было при человеке.
Bears, wolves, beavers and yellow-beaked swans have reappeared in the exclusion zone.
Подойдешь ко мне, поможешь просто.
Sergei Gaschak has studied these new residents for many years. the bats in particular. He showed that Chernobyl's exclusion zone has become a new territory for bats, some of which are very rare species that have never before been seen in the Ukraine.
Первое животное – это бурый ушанты, Cotus auritus. Обычный европейский вид, и в Украине тоже. И интересно было узнать, как они живут здесь, на этой территории, на которой предоставилось огромное количество возможностей. Заброшенные дома, огромное количество старых деревьев. Никто им не мешает жить и развиваться. Как они реагируют на них. Ну, в данном случае мы видим. Вот на территории Чернобыльской зоны, в самом центре, город Припять. Животное абсолютно здоровое, великолепно выглядит. Какие красивые крылья, какие ушки. Вот.
These bats eat insects contaminated with cesium and strontium, and like their cousins the mice, they show unprecedented amounts of radiation, and yet show no signs of alteration, defying all logic. The multitude of new arrivals in the exclusion zone has a very natural consequence: an increase in the population of predators, and in particular that of large carnivores.
Хищников, а именно пока мы можем говорить о крупных хищниках, это о волке, однозначно стало больше после аварии. Рост его численности наблюдался практически с самых первых лет. Только исчез человек, волк очень умное, очень пластичное животное, легко приспосабливается к изменениям окружающей среды. Естественно, он эту территорию освоил довольно быстро. Но сколько именно волков на территории непосредственно Чернобыльской зоны, сложно сказать, их никто не считал.
There are other signs that confirm the recolonization of the exclusion zone by a varied but discrete fauna since man left. In the winter, the tracks the animals cannot help but make give the scientists precious information. For years, on every one of his missions, Sergei Gashchak has collected all of his observations on the wild fauna. He has thus created a database of the resident species, their distribution, and their way of life. This solitary, meticulous work allows him to have a true estimate of the situation of the exclusion zone's animals.
Можно сказать, несмотря на отсутствие достаточного количества фактических данных, можно сказать, что баланс между хищниками и копытными в Чернобыльской зоне достиг некого природного равновесия. И он находится в балансе в том числе и с растительностью, с кормовой базой для копытных. То есть вот эта триада растительность, как мы называем, фитофаги, копытные, и хищники находятся в равновесии, свойственном природе этого региона. Ну вот, разве не удивительно? Мы находимся в центре города Припять. Но, тем не менее, все вокруг покрыто следами диких животных. Тут и кабан прошел, и лось прошел. Здесь вот следы косули, там видели лисицы, огромное количество зайцев, там чуть дальше волк. А тем не менее, рядом дворец культуры, ресторан, вот там вот техникум находится. Это все восхищает, это ничем не отличается от того, что мы можем увидеть за пределами города, на лесах, лугах. Животных совершенно не пугают эти постройки.
The severe lack of money in the Ukraine also has consequences for the wild fauna. The enclosure that is the exclusion zone has been abandoned for quite some time, which has given it a very particular and unexpected role.
Ну, вот так вот выглядит на сегодняшний день один из участков ограждения Чернобыльской зоны. Конечно, оно не является препятствием для диких животных, и они могут ходить как в одну сторону, так и в другую. И за последние годы Чернобыльская зона стала настоящим источником диких животных для окружающих территорий. Но, разумеется, им лучше всего находиться в Чернобыльской зоне. Они никак не воспринимают радиацию, их привлекает прежде всего огромное количество убежищ, огромное количество кормов. И в целом на территории Чернобыльской зоны за последние 20 лет создался великолепный естественный комплекс дикой природы, который здесь существовал сотни лет тому назад.
In the enormous Chernobyl zone, nature seems to be taking back what belongs to it in the very place where a tragedy occurred that shattered the lives of hundreds of thousands of human beings. But if nature has adapted, the cost was high and much was lost, particularly during the first years following the catastrophe. Sacrifices that would be deemed unacceptable for the human race. And what is the situation in the long term?
It was such a tragedy, yet there is such a treasure there now for scientists to use to study the effects of radiation. I think that we know only a fraction of the story at this point, a very small percentage. We've learned a lot, but what we need to discern now is why we see what we see. What is it that allows these animals to live in this environment with what seems to be little consequence?
I'm deeply surprised that the International Atomic Energy Agency has not done anything to establish such a research facility, to investigate the negative effects of radiation accidents. Now there's a big surge in building of nuclear power plants. So we must know what are the worst consequences. And this is a unique opportunity.
Chernobyl's last paradoxes are not the least. The exclusion zone is being threatened, firstly by an unstable political situation in the Ukraine and a lack of money, but also by new plans to reopen certain parts for economic reasons, such as the treatment and burial of nuclear waste coming from elsewhere.
Я бы очень хотел, чтобы здесь существовал заповедник. В любом виде, в любой форме, но желательно в наивысшей форме защиты природы. И чтобы здесь существовал соответствующий научный персонал, научная база, чтобы была нормальная охрана, чтобы проводились... То есть я, в общем-то, мечтал бы об этом. Я могу только выразить свою надежду, что, как говорят, сказал Достоевский в свое время, красота спасет мир. Я надеюсь, что красота этого региона его тоже защитит.
An extraordinary thing has happened to Chernobyl's dead zone. It's become a post-nuclear paradise for a huge variety of wildlife. Join us to explore this strange new world next today on Eden in Radioactive Wolves.